Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Ask a Property Manager, episode number 23. Today is June 3rd, 2020. We're coming to you live from Studio 1.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo, Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be answering some questions from around the internet. Before we do that, we're going to jump into our social media plugs. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager go live every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. You can find those on Facebook, facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes. You can find the live there every Wednesday at 10 a.m. You can also find replays there after the episode airs as well. Follow us on Instagram over at instagram.com/ownbuffalo. And you can also subscribe on YouTube. We do post some content on YouTube that doesn't find its way to our Facebook page, so it's good to be subscribed in both places. You can find the link for that over on our homepage at ownbuffalo.com. And you can always grab a free consultation with me over at ownbuffalo.com as well. I'm actually going to jump over to my desktop screen here and show you. We do have a couple of time slots open this week on Thursday and Friday. And then next week we have some time slots open as well. It's a little bit light next week just because we have our end of month accounting and things like that to deal with. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we go ahead to schedule these appointments, so that it doesn't interfere with our normal business operations. Welcome to June, everyone. Hopefully you're all staying safe. Hopefully your rent collections are going well. We're now in phase 2 of the reopening plan here in Western New York, which is great news. That means that, so in phase 1, we were able to resume construction for the most part, albeit with restrictions as to number of people on job sites and things like that. And now that we're in phase 2, that means that we can start doing a little bit more real estate activity. We're finally able to start showing apartments again. We're able to start showing properties again. And again, albeit with restrictions. There's going to be masks and things like that in place, as well as hand sanitizer, cleaning after every showing, things like that. There's some restrictions in place that we have to follow, but we're happy to be moving forward. So that's good news. We're glad to be in phase 2. Hopefully, I think it's 2 weeks before we can go into phase 3. So hopefully we move smoothly through phase 2 and into phase 3, which will open up some more businesses. And then phase 4 being the final phase, that's where we really start to get some of our larger venues back and things like that. So that'll be interesting. I think there's still a lot more prep for those people than what they may realize, but honestly, hopefully we just get sports back. That's really all I want, is to be able to watch the Buffalo Bills by the time fall rolls around. So enough about June and phased reopenings and things like that. Let's jump right into the questions. The first question of the day is, what is one tenant screening rule that you always follow with no exceptions? This one was pulled from the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. What is the one tenant screening rule that I always follow? All of them. And the reason I pulled that question was to give that answer. We have a written set of criteria that we operate under every single time that we screen a tenant. We don't deviate from it, and it's something that's been reviewed by our attorneys to ensure that it's fair housing compliant. Having that written set of criteria that you can point to every single time and say, well, this tenant doesn't meet the standard, or this tenant does meet the standard. Don't just make decisions willy-nilly. Have an idea. Have selection criteria, and I don't care if it's one unit that you own, if it's a dozen, if it's 120, if it's 1,000. Having those written criteria is so critical because it helps you to make decisions and take emotion out of it in a lot of instances, which sometimes that's what's necessary. So definitely have written screening criteria. It doesn't matter to me how many units you have. You can find screening criteria all over the internet. I know we did an Ask a Property Manager about it a couple weeks back. I apologize I didn't go and pull the episode number. You can also find that info. I know Rent Prep's got it on their website, Bigger Pockets, tons of different resources where you can find tenant screening criteria if you are in need. Next question, renting to students and new renters. This one was also pulled from the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. Hi everyone, just getting started. Would greatly appreciate your advice on how you approach applicants who are students and don't have any credit history. No rent history or references either, since it's going to be their first year in college. They won't work or would work part-time, so it would be the parents primarily be paying for the housing. My thought is to have one parent / all parents of each student co-sign the credit application. We need to be able to verify the income and credit history of the financially responsible person. What would you recommend? Thank you. So we've actually got quite a bit of experience in this. We used to manage quite a bit of student rental in the University at Buffalo South Campus area. Um, and we seem to have a mix of tenants, and it was, people from downstate New York who were coming up to UB and going to school. And we also seemed to get a lot of exchange students, which was nice. Um, the way that we used to combat it in New York State was first, last, and security. That's definitely no longer an option here in New York. They've limited that so that you can no longer do like a first, last, and security situation. So what it boils down to at the end of the day is good tenant screening. And in a situation like this where you're going to wind up with co-signers, number one, I think co-signers is the absolute right move to go on this. But when you're screening, make sure that you screen not just the tenant that's going to be living in the property, but also the person who's going to be guaranteeing the lease as well. I would recommend getting as many guarantors on the lease as possible. So if you have, I think it said 3 students. Let's see here. Okay, I guess it doesn't say the number of bedrooms. However many students or however many new renters you're going to have living in the apartment, you should have that many co-signers as well. Have each parent as a co-signer, and keep in mind that they can be jointly and severally liable as well. You'll want to talk to your attorney to make sure that you have that kind of language in your lease agreement to make sure that everyone's on the same page. But essentially what you're trying to do here is prevent one tenant from defaulting and walking away. And the best way to do that is by making sure that everyone is on the hook for each other as well. So if they're going to go into a living situation where they're going to be living, with friends, obviously if it's college students, they tend to be a little bit younger. This might be one of the first experiences that they have in a truly adult situation. Prepare for that. Understand that the parents are going to contact you, and if the parents are a co-signer, then they have every right to contact you. But if the tenants, if it's just a student and they don't have a parent co-signer, don't let that parent jump in the middle of situations with that student. Let them handle their own adult situations until they sign off on a release allowing you to talk to the parent. So just be careful about who you're speaking to and about what you're speaking to them, about, to make sure that you're protecting yourself and keeping your tenants safe. Tenant screening red flag. Hi everyone, new landlord here. I have a prospective tenant with verified background and credit history, good references from his employer and present landlord. Unfortunately, when I contacted the previous landlord, a large apartment complex, the manager denied having a record of him as a tenant. What would you do? If this happens to you, will you let the tenant rent from you, or you have other ways to verify? So there's a couple things you can do here. Number one, good on you for checking not just the most recent landlord, but also the previous landlord. A lot of landlords don't do that, and usually the previous landlord is where you're going to find the truth. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times, and I hate it when landlords do this, and it's a practice that we don't engage in, but you'll get a landlord that will give you a stellar reference on a tenant just to get them out of their unit because they know the tenant's a nightmare. We won't do that. We would rather not provide a reference than provide a reference that's going to paint that tenant in a positive light when they're a negative tenant. So we won't engage in something like that. There's a couple of different scenarios that are kind of playing out in my head here. It could be that the person was not listed on the lease, so he could have been either a sublet. It could have been his parents were on the lease, his or her parents were on the lease, and he was not. There's different things there that would not necessarily be a cause for concern. You could have a different management company now than what the management company was when the gentleman lived at the property. And I'm assuming gentlemen, I apologize, but you might have a different management company. They may not have all of the records from the previous occupancies or something like that. It could be under somebody else's name. This is one of those situations where actually when you run the credit history, you may be able to see previous addresses that have been used by that person on credit applications and on credit accounts and things like that. So if they had like an auto loan bill or a credit card bill, a utility bill sent to that address, you may actually see it listed as an address on their credit history. That's one way to look at it. The other thing you can do is just flat out ask the tenant or the applicant, hey, I couldn't get a landlord reference from 123 Main Street. They said they didn't have any record of you living there. Could you explain? And just ask the question. Sometimes there's a legitimate reason, and you may have to do a little bit more research to find out if the answer they're giving you is truly legitimate or not. But, sometimes the best possible scenario is just ask the person what's going on, why can't we find you, and then go from there. It may not necessarily be a big deal, or you could uncover something that causes you to deny the application, but you won't really know until you do the research. Sharing info about tenants. We actually touched a little bit on this in one of our previous questions. How much information am I allowed to give prospective tenants about the tenant on the other side of a duplex? This question was pulled from Reddit. I think this was from the R Landlord subreddit. I own a duplex in the Indianapolis area that I rent out both sides on. And a question I often get from an applicant is, what's the neighbor like, or something along those lines. I was just curious how much, if any, information I'm allowed to give in these scenarios. Can I tell them it's a single female? Can I say it's a single person with no pets? Can I say that it's a person around 30 years old who's a nurse? Just trying to get some guidance on what I can and cannot say. Thanks so much. So this is one of those things that I kind of take a grandstand stance on. We won't give out information about any of our tenants under any circumstances, unless that tenant has signed a release or I'm presented with some kind of a valid order from law enforcement or an attorney or whatever that I need to provide information. We just don't. If somebody asks us what the neighbor's like, I can tell them, yeah, the unit's occupied or it's vacant. We've never had any issues with the tenant or something along those lines. I don't reveal names, ages, pets, if any, children, if any, none of that stuff. And it's ultimately to protect the tenant base that we have. Like we're not out there trying to expose our tenants and share information with everybody under the sun. And we take that responsibility seriously. So you do have some sort of a responsibility, I would say, to protect the data, to protect the privacy of your tenants. And by answering a lot of the things that you had mentioned in your question there, can I say it's a single person? No. Can I say no pets? I wouldn't. Can I say it's a person around 30 years old who works at? No, definitely not. Don't overexpose yourself in a situation like this. I would leave it as, unfortunately, we don't disclose any information about any of our other tenants. That's a service or a courtesy that would gladly extend to you if you become a tenant of ours as well. And leave it at that. I wouldn't go into any information that you don't necessarily have to. I would say, oh, the unit next door, yes, it's occupied, or no, it's vacant, or something like that. And I would probably leave it at that. Don't overexpose yourself, and certainly don't overexpose your tenants. Selling an occupied property. This is from the Our Landlord subreddit on Reddit. This is actually a New York-based question. What is the process to sell property with existing tenants? I own a townhouse with 3 rental units in New York City. I would like to sell it to someone next year, and I was wondering what the process is like to sell a property like this. If you've done something like this before, what was it like? And what advice, if any, would you give me? So New York City's market operates a little bit differently than the market in the rest of New York State, but ultimately it's still going to be the same general guidelines, I would think. Number one, in the state of New York, leases survive the sale of a property. So any lease that's in place when you sell that property carries over, conveys to the new owner as part of the sale of that property. The leases are still valid and enforceable. The tenants will still owe their rent. They'll still be responsible for all of the same lease clauses and everything else, and that just carries on as you close the transaction. In upstate New York, you'll fill out what's called a rental property rider when you list the property for sale, and that'll include information, basic information about the tenants, the rent, the security deposit, what utilities are included, what appliances are included, when is the rent due. I think I mentioned security deposit, but if not, I know that's on there. Just basics about the tenant so that whoever is looking at purchasing the property has a little bit of a deal information so they can start to do a little bit of analysis if they want to. That is the information that gets conveyed to the buyer as part of the transaction. Generally speaking, you'll have, as part of the due diligence period, the opportunity to turn over any leases and supporting documentation for review. And the buyer has the opportunity to review that information and act accordingly. So it's a pretty straightforward process. If you have 3 tenants in those units, expect that you're still going to have 3 tenants in those units when you sell. This may present an issue if somebody wants to live in one unit and rent the other 2 units out. You may want to wait to sell until you're in a position where you have a vacancy. Or if you're trying to sell it strictly as an investment property, go ahead and list it. I mean, investors generally want properties that have tenants already in them. It's less work, it's cash flow from day one, etc., etc. So that's what I would do. Don't be afraid to sell the property with the 3 tenants inside of it if you're selling it strictly to investors. Or if you're looking to sell to an owner-occupant or investor, you might want to wait until you have 1 unit available. That gives an owner-occupant the opportunity to move in. Or if they, are if it is an investor that purchases it, they can just turn around and refill that 1 unit. So that is my thoughts on that. 1 tenant moving out. This one was pulled from the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. I have a couple that moved into one of my rentals about a month ago. Now they've broken up and he wants her off the lease. Can I just cross her off the documents, or do I need to sign a new one? You've got a few different things at play here. The first thing is you have people who have split up. They're both contractually obligated on that lease. You have to decide as a landlord, do you want to remove one party from the lease? Because you really aren't under any obligation to do so at this point by the sounds of what you're saying here. First thing I would do would be go back and look at my tenant screening documentation and make sure that the male party can actually support the apartment on their own, that they have sufficient income, that they meet all the other criteria that they need to meet in order to qualify for the apartment on their own. If they don't meet the criteria on their own, I wouldn't move to a situation where it's just them on the lease, because you're going to be asking for headaches in the long run. So assuming that person does meet the criteria and you do want to remove the female party from the lease, double check that, cross her off the document. So it's the female party that's leaving. If you do want to remove her from the lease, you need to have a signed release by both parties. Essentially that as of X date, the female party is being removed from the lease and has no further obligation. The male party is obligated for the duration of the lease period. And that release also should specify what happens with regards to the security deposit. So if it's a situation where they paid the security deposit together, then you may need to work out a situation where, or actually really in whatever situation, I don't tend to get involved in what they decide to do with the deposit. I just want to know who's getting the deposit at the time of move out. And there really shouldn't be any question as to why someone's getting the deposit, because it's written right into your agreement, removing the other person from the lease. So they can situate the security deposit on their own. You just need to know what ultimately was the deciding factor so that you know who to refund the security deposit to when the remaining party moves out. And I would absolutely make sure to get that in writing as part of the move out, as part of the first person's move out, the female party's move out, so that you have that and there's no possible chance of headache down the road. So that is what I would recommend in that instance. Guys, that pretty much wraps up our questions for this week. Thank you so much for watching. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can help us to improve. Drop a question in the comments either on Facebook or YouTube, and your question may be answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if I brought some value to your day, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, and we want to help as many people as possible. By liking, commenting, and subscribing, you're sharing, you're helping us to grow, and we really do appreciate that. Next week's episode will be on June 10th, which is next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be doing a deal analysis. So if you have a deal that you're interested in learning more about, please go ahead and submit it to us, and we may just review it live on the air. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.